Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will be speaking with Steve Sweeney. Steve is a multimedia journalist, writer, and political activist. He is a member of the National Union of Journalists and the international editor for the Morning Star newspaper, where he writes on labor and progressive issues with an interest in Turkey, Kurdistan, and the Middle East, along with Latin America and global liberation movements. He is the co-editor of the Kurdistan Media Project and co-founder of Journalists for Democracy in Turkey and Kurdistan. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So you have recently returned from South Kurdistan. You have been spending, you spent a lot of time there this past year, and we together did an interview earlier in July that I can direct people to watch. There will be a link available below. But you've since spent more time in the region, and I was wondering if you could give us a brief overview of your most recent stay there and an update of the situation on the ground now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd like to be able to report that things have improved since I was there last, but sadly, the situation continues to deteriorate. And in fact, I think Turkey has been emboldened by the global silence, not just from the international community, but also organisations including NATO, the United Nations, the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, and it's been emboldened by their silence, which has allowed it to continue this genocidal war that it's waging in Iraqi Kurdistan against the Kurdish people at the moment. Since July, I mean, there's been now, Turkey's become a bit more bold and brazen in its activities. And since then, we've seen the bombing of the Mahmoud refugee camp, which it's been bombed twice. And I think this is important to understand that this is a United Nations administered refugee camp, home to 12,000 people. I stayed there for 2 weeks last year, and I went to the site of a chemical weapons attack during that visit, which took place last summer, and they've attacked it. They've attacked it again, and when President Erdogan, just before he attacked it, he warned that he was going to do it. He told the world that he would be acting as a United Nations member state. So this wasn't Turkey acting as Turkey, as a rogue nation. He was very clear that he was acting as a United Nations member state, and he launched what is alleged to be a chemical weapons attack on a refugee camp which is home to 12,000 Kurdish people, men, women, and young children. Now, this is a war crime. Attacking a refugee camp is undoubtedly a war crime. And but has there been any kind of response to this? Well, I think I think one of the American ambassadors or something might have said we're concerned or expressed some kind of concern. It was a very kind of meek and mild response from a minor official as well. It's not like this wasn't like a representative of the United States government, or a senior, certainly not a senior member of the representative of the government. The United Nations, who he said he was acting on behalf of, have remained silent. NATO, of which Turkey represents the second largest land army, said absolutely nothing. And this has spiraled now. So the camp has been attacked twice. 2 missile strikes. The first, I think the first one killed 3 people. The second one, luckily, didn't kill anybody, but that's not the point. The intention was to kill people, certainly, or at very least intimidate them. And then over the intervening months between July and now, we've seen an escalation of Turkish aggression towards Şengal, which is the Yazidi populated part of it's part of northern Iraq. It sits in the contested areas, but it's also been subjected to a security deal, which means that it's been signed behind the back of the Yazidi people. They weren't involved in this at all, and it was signed between the KDP essentially and Baghdad, with the agreement of, and at the behest of, the United States, France, and other Western imperialist powers who have welcomed this. The aim of this really was they wanted to drive out. They didn't say but, well, they did actually. They said they want to drive out armed gangs, and by that they meant the PKK. And the reason for this is that Shengal operates, a system of self-administration and self-governance. And of course, this is a huge threat to democracy, because it shows that there's another way of doing things differently than the system that's operated, and the kind of grip on power that the Kurdistan Democratic Party has on the Kurdish region in Iraq. So of course, again, what we saw in this region was, well, the first incident was the execution. And this is what it was: the targeted assassination of a Yazidi commander, Saeed Hassan. And the significance of this, again, was he was targeted in a vehicle as he was traveling to meet Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who is the Iraqi Prime Minister. And it was the first time an Iraqi Prime Minister had traveled to the region. Now, let's remember, of course, this was the region that was the subject of a 2014 genocide by ISIS, in which 5,000 men and boys were executed, thousands of women and girls were sold into sexual slavery. I think more than 3,000 of those are still missing, and is a lot of the Yazidi community are still in refugee camps. I've been to some of them in Iraqi Kurdistan, and it's very difficult for them to return to their homeland because it's being bombed by Turkey. And so 2 days after the execution, or a few days, I can't remember the exact timeline, after the execution of the Yazidi commander, which was deliberate, well, it was, again, this is a war crime. We have to call things as they are. But even worse than that, days later, there was a Turkish airstrike on a hospital in Shengal, and 8 people were killed. 4 of those were health workers, and 4 of those were members of the the Yazidi armed forces. And we should also say that this isn't like an armed militia, or however you want to call it. These are legitimate defence forces, but also they are part of what is called the Popular Mobilisation Forces, which are people call them an Iranian militia, but they are a force that is operating in Iraq as part of the anti-ISIS, the fight against jihadist groups, and ISIS being one of them. And this is like a stepping stone into joining the regular Iraqi army. So this is not, these are not, however Erdogan wants to paint them, this is not, he would want to say that these are terrorists, but of course every Kurd to him, or every Yazidi to him, is a terrorist. You have to again call this exactly what it is, and this is a war crime. Bombing a hospital and the deliberate targeting of infrastructure is a war crime. And again, these 2 incidents happened to a blanket silence from the international community. Virtually no coverage in the international press either, and people that I talk to about this are amazed when I tell them that these kind of things are happening. And then we have again another assassination, which was the killing of Yasin Bulut, who is they said a senior PKK cadre. This is a 65-year-old man who is receiving treatment for a medical complaint. I believe it was cancer, actually, that he was being treated for in Soleimani. And he was executed outside his home in broad daylight. And there's very strong suspicion and the very strong likelihood that this was carried out by Turkish intelligence services, or people acting on behalf of Turkish intelligence services. And this was quite chilling, because now we're talking about an incursion into a city, a civilian populated city. And there are supporters of the PKK within Soleimani. I met many of them. I lived among them for a very long time. But they're a legitimate political party, a legitimate political organisation, and they carry out day-to-day kind of activities, which, you know, holding meetings or whatever, and, you know, you know, they're part of the political structure and the political life of the city. Now, this was, and I believe very strongly that this was a warning, and this was a warning to Kurds, not just in Sulaymaniyah, but everywhere, saying it doesn't matter where you are, we will hunt you down and we can kill you, and we can do it with impunity. And yeah, and again, this was, you know, this should be condemned by the international community. This is, you know, this is another targeted assassination of, you know, of an individual who was going about his daily life and was receiving treatment in hospital. But again, I feel like I'm repeating myself over and over again, but there was you know, there was a blanket silence. I think there was some condemnation from elements of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the PUK, which are the main party in the, you know, in the Sulaymaniyah region. But again, that's in the context of a power struggle and fractures within that party, with some closer to the PKK than others. But I mean, there's always been a general kind of rule that they can operate in you know, in the city. But yeah, I think, you know, things are. I don't know whether, you know, we're in a very dangerous situation at the moment, because, and I think this is really the crux of what we're going to be talking about, is Turkey's incessant use of chemical weapons. And this is something that has been reported by myself in the Morning Star. I reported back, I can't remember when it was now, in May or June, about chemical weapons attacks that were targeting guerrilla fighters and resistance fighters in the Aveshin mountain region. And this led to calling the Turkish Grand Assembly, the Turkish Parliament, for the establishment of a commission of inquiry. Now, of course, the Turkish Grand Assembly, the Turkish Parliament, rejected this. The call was made by the People's Democratic Party, the HDP, which is the only real opposition, you know, politically in the Turkish Parliament, and it was deemed to be insulting. And I'm not entirely sure what the insult was. I'm guessing it was it was daring to suggest that the Turkish military might be using banned substances and chemical weapons. But the reality is Turkey has a very long history of using such chemical weapons. You know, not just in Iraqi Kurdistan, but it's used in Rojava. We saw Afrin and Serikaniya, where there was the issue about, well, is white phosphorus a chemical or not a chemical? And you know, this is where the OPCW decided they weren't going to investigate. But white phosphorus is a chemical. It's allowed. It has limited use in military purposes, in that the military are allowed to use it as cover. So they can drop it and they can use it because it emits a gas which makes it very difficult for people to see, and they can use it as cover for their armed forces if they're retreating or if they're entering an area for military combat. What they can't do is drop it, as they did, in civilian areas and target civilian population, causing the horrific burns that we saw. Because I mean, white phosphorus is a horrific weapon when it's used in this way. And we saw everybody will remember, I'm sure many people remember the image of the young boy screaming for his dad, saying make it stop, and as he was burning, and he was then treated in France. But so Turkey has a long history of this. I mean, we can go all the way back to Dersim, and Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's adopted daughter Sabiha Gökçen she dropped chemical weapons on Kurds during the uprising there. So it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask, but it's not one that we should be asking. It's one that the world powers should be asking, and they should be launching an immediate investigation into this. They've been asked many times. Yesterday there were demonstrations outside the offices of the United Nations in Geneva, outside the offices of the OPCW in The Hague, calling for an end to Turkey's war crimes and demanding that they actually fulfill their duty and carry out an investigation into this. I mean, we're not talking one or two chemical bombs being dropped. We're talking about hundreds of incidents of the use of chemical weapons, and they're doing that because they're stuck in a war that they can't win. They're meeting fierce resistance from guerrilla fighters, and they're hardly making any advances at all. So they can't defeat them through normal military means. So they're resorting to the use of chemical weapons, and this again is. This string of atrocities, and Turkey's charge sheet is growing longer and longer by the day, but they're growing more and more bold by the day as well because of the continued silence from the international community.
Absolutely. So, as you said, and you were correct, the issue of chemical weapons would be the primary subject for our discussion. Before we move on, though, I wanted to ask also if you can, what you can say about what the relations are like now between the KDP and the PKK in this most recent period, if there are any updates on that situation and what you saw from your time there.
Well, there is no relationship in terms of the KDP and the PKK.
The chances of conflict, the risk of escalating conflict.
Other than the Kurdistan Democratic Party has been beating the war drums for a very, very long time. And it started when I first remember in October or November last year, when it started talking about flushing the PKK out of the Kandil Mountains. And there was a huge anti-war bloc that was formed between all of the opposition parties within the Iraqi Kurdistan region. That included the PUK, it included the Kurdistan Communist Party of Iraq, it included the Goran movement, every organization, human rights organizations, the Peace Mothers, and we were holding protests in Slimani against this move to war. Now that kind of died down a little bit. There seemed it seemed to quieten down a bit, and then in April, obviously, Operation Claw Lightning was launched by Turkey. This bombing and ground invasion, but they've been supported wholeheartedly by the Kurdistan Democratic Party. So there's reports of them sharing intelligence, sharing military information. The coordinates of the PKK fighters are being gifted to the Turkish military by the KDP and their Peshmerga forces have launched numerous attacks on Kurdistan Workers' Party positions. They've attacked camps. Now, unfortunately, some of those Peshmerga forces have been killed as a result of those operations. And the PKK have always been very, very clear that they don't want an intra-Kurdish war, and they don't want to fight what they say are their Kurdish brothers. And they have time after time. Cemal Bayik has spoken about peace, and there's been numerous countless efforts to resolve this situation through negotiations, through talks, but the KDP has led this drive to war. So that relationship is incredibly fraught, as I'm sure that you can understand, and I think that the KDP is a very complex situation because the KDP's power rests on Turkey, and Turkey's power rests on the imperialist forces. So Britain, the US and NATO and the European Union, of course, they rely on the Kurdistan Democratic Party to act as an internal policeman inside the region. So this is why any kind of they control every aspect of life, is whether it's the media, whether it's Rudal or Kurdistan 24, they're in firm control of this. They can control of the television stations. They control every they control who can work, who can't work, through a system of patronage, and this again keeps them in power. We've got an election, the elections coming up, which we're not going to see any great changes, I don't think, because of that. But so they're they don't want to see a democratic region, and I spoke to many people that have said that the Barzani family are just as bad, if not worse, than Saddam Hussein. Now that is a very, very strong claiming a very, very strong accusation to make, particularly by Kurds who, as we know, suffered horrendously through the Anfal campaign. But these are people I spoke to that were survivors of the Anfal and survivors of Halabja that were very, very critical of the Kurdistan Democratic Party. And equally, these same people, and I'm talking ordinary people in the street, in the cafes, in the local shops, people that I spoke to are supportive of the PKK and their right to their right to resist, their right to exist, and they see them as a force working for the liberation of the Kurdish people. They know full well if the PKK isn't there, is removed from the mountains, then that barrier that is preventing a genocide of the Kurds is removed, and that's what's at stake here. I mean, this is a really this is really important to for people to understand, is that this isn't about the PKK. This is about the genocide of the Kurdish people. Now, Tayyip Erdogan, we know, wants to, his plan is to grab more and more land, and his incursion, people are saying that he wants to even go as far as taking Mosul, which was, he's an Ottoman revivalist. Essentially, that's what he's trying to do, is to rebuild the Ottoman Empire and take control of lands that he believes are Turkish lands. And the imperialist powers are quite happy for him to do that. Why? Because they have their concerns within the region and their regional interests, which, as per usual, are control of oil and regional hegemony, which is why they use Turkey as, Turkey operates as NATO's battering ram in the Middle East, whether it's in northern Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan, or northern Syria. That's the role that Turkey plays. And people so often say, oh well, Turkey is a NATO member state. It's like, yes, it is a NATO member state, but it's acting exactly as a NATO member state would act. It's acting exactly as a United Nations member state would act. It's acting, on behalf of the imperialist powers. And you only need to look at how they operate around the rest of the world to see that what Turkey's doing is exactly the kind of behaviour that's replicated in other countries. And this is why they're silent, because they support Turkey's actions.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, the KDP relationship is, of course, central to this. And I think we also have to say that when you look at politically, for example, and I mentioned this, I think, in the previous interview, we have like an all-party parliamentary group for Kurdistan in the British Parliament. There are two, and there's a reason that there are two. But the one that represents Iraqi Kurdistan, is really operates as Barzani's mouthpiece in Westminster, and it's remained silent over, not only over the Turkish invasion and occupation, which is in breach of international law and in a breach of Iraqi sovereignty. They've not only remained silent about that, they've remained silent about the internal repression, which has seen the 81 journalists and activists known as the Badinan journalists and activists, who are now on hunger strike in Erbil prison, because these are people that were critical of the government. Part of, some of them were part of the anti-government protest that sprung up over the failures to pay public sector wages. Some of them have been critical of the government for a failure to provide services, and there's huge shortages of electricity, there's huge shortages of fuel across the region as well. But they'd also probed at corruption within the Barzani family, and of course now these people are in prison. So they've remained silent over all of those things. But as soon as the PKK are accused of doing something, all of a sudden they're on top of that. So this is an organisation which you won't be surprised to learn that is funded by Barzani-linked oil companies, and they pay £60,000 a year for the secretariat of that group. So it's not an independent group, and people in Britain should take absolutely no notice of what it says.
Yeah, it's just so stark, so explicit that. But to segue back to the issue of chemical weapons, So as you said, the first reports began to emerge earlier this spring in this most recent period of
Yeah.
use of chemical weapons, and you've been reporting on this issue from the ground for some time, and so if you mentioned already a bit of this, the general overview, and as you said, Turkey's becoming increasingly more bold as time goes on because of the silence. So could you give a sense of sort of how it started, and then it seems that the frequency of chemical attacks have been escalating as time goes on
Yeah.
in the most recent period. So can you give a little brief overview of this most recent period of
Well,
use?
I mean, I think, like you said, I mean, it's been intensifying, and I think it started off with chemical attacks that were the Turkish state will deny that they use chemical weapons, but the chemical attacks initially were in tunnels that were used by guerrilla fighters, and these the chemicals were fired down into the tunnels, and of course we saw the result of this. But now they've become more bold, and I've lost count really now of the number of chemical attacks. It's every day that it seems to be that I'm met with reports of chemical weapons attacks across in the Avashim Mountains, and the chemical weapons are now not just targeting PKK fighters or Kurdish guerrilla fighters, they're targeting the civilian population. So there was an incident, I think maybe 2 weeks ago, where some elderly Kurdish villagers were treated in hospital for the effect of a chemical attack. And again, this was very well documented. There's health reports that that indicate that this was the injuries, and people were hospitalized, they couldn't breathe, and this is part of now Turkey's been emboldened to carry out these kind of attacks. Now the attacks were always on civilian populations. I mean, that's again right from the start. This wasn't about targeting Kurdish resistance fighters or PKK positions. I mean, there's been nearly 2,000 Kurdish villagers flushed out of their homes, and I think not in this period, but I think there's something like 800 Kurdish villages have been emptied as a result of Turkey's attacks. So I mean, this is a very serious issue, and the use of chemical weapons. I mean, we've seen. I think we need to talk about the OPCW a little bit, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Now, for those that don't know what this is the body that was set up, I think, in 1997, April 97, and its role was to monitor the implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Now, this convention was aimed at ridding the world of chemical weapons, and perhaps unsurprisingly, but given given its title, and it's supported by 190 odd countries across the world. It has 190 something member states, and initially it was supposed to be an independent organization, and it monitored, for example, Syria. It played a role in monitoring the destruction of of Syria's chemical weapon stockpile, and it's done the same in other countries. And I think Syria was deemed to have complied with its need to do that in 2016. I think it joined in 2013, and the United Nations and the OPCW oversaw that. And initially the OPCW would investigate accusations or of chemical attacks wherever they occurred. Then they would send a team in, an investigating team, and sometimes these would take a long time, because as you can imagine, they have to, there's a lot of science involved in this, and gaining access to the sites and what have you. So initially it was kind of an independent organization that would only determine whether a chemical attack had taken place. That was all it did. It would say yes or no, right? And it would say, generally, it would say the nature of the chemical attack. So they would probably deduct what chemicals were used, whether it was sarin or whatever. But in 2018, that changed, and it was given more powers. and it was given more powers for a specific reason. It was given more powers so that it could attribute blame. So it would move beyond its remit of deciding simply whether an attack took place. They would say, well, yes, an attack took place, and this is who was responsible for it. Now, the timing of this was entirely, wasn't a coincidence. They did it because it was done in order to prove or to pin the blame for chemical weapons attacks on Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And at the time, a number of warnings were issued saying that, that now the credibility of the OPCW, as an independent organization, is seriously damaged, and Russia, Syria, and other countries, quite rightly, in my view, said that the OPCW is now simply a tool of imperialism, and it's operating at their behest. And I've written quite extensively about this as well, so I'm sure people, if they want to read about it, we can post some links to this. But there was a very serious incident in Duma in 2018 when the world powers, Britain, the US, and France in particular, blamed a chemical attack in Duma on the Syrian Arab army, and they said Assad had bombed, used chemicals on his own people. And without any investigations or any kind of confirmation of this, they instantly launched missile strikes on Syria. Now, this was incredibly serious because this could have led to an even bigger global conflagration in the region, which was already destabilized. Now, since that happened, the story unraveled very, very quickly. Over whether Assad actually had used chemical weapons, and there's even doubt whether chemical weapons were used at all. And the final OPCW report actually was inconclusive. But what they did do was they hid a dissenting report by a senior engineer called Ian Henderson, who said, well, actually, this is somebody with decades of experience with the OPCW, who said that the cylinders in the supposed site of the attack were actually placed there manually, and they hadn't dropped from above, which of course countered the official narrative, which was that they were dropped from a helicopter by the Syrian army. But this was hidden. This dissenting report from the final report, and it took myself and Peter Hitchens in Britain of the Mail on Sunday were the only two journalists that actually followed this up and reported on it. And this. In fact, very recently, the BBC had to backtrack and apologise for their coverage of the events in Duma. But I mean, this casts some very, very serious doubt on the credibility of the OPCW. And now it becomes, if you're talking about it becoming a political tool of the imperialist powers, then you realise, well, it's not a surprise that they haven't investigated the use of chemical weapons in Kurdistan and by Turkey, because imagine the embarrassment if they're caught as a NATO member state, a member of the United Nations, a signatory to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and a member of the OPCW, who's donated something like €30,000 very recently, to the OPCW, has used chemical weapons. And then the question will be, well, where did they get the chemical weapons from? Who supplied them? Because Turkey also says that it doesn't have a chemical weapons stockpile. Surprise, surprise. Although it's been known to ship chemical weapons to jihadist groups in Syria, across the border. We know that they've been caught out doing that with sarin gas and other chemicals. So there's certainly, while it might not have a declared stockpile, I'm very confident that it does have some chemical weapons. So anyway, this is a very, very serious issue. And like I said earlier, and I'll say it again, Turkey is committing war crimes in Iraqi Kurdistan. The use of chemical weapons is a war crime. The bombing of a refugee camp is a war crime. The bombing of a hospital is a war crime. The execution of a military commander is a war crime. So the charge sheet is a long one, but it continues to act with impunity. Now, the demonstrations that took place yesterday were demanding that the world powers take some kind of action. Now, of course, they should, but also they have to hang the charges of war crimes on Tayyip Erdogan. And instead of rolling out the red carpet to him and inviting him to meetings at the European Union or state visits in Britain, they should be dragging him in front of the Hague and trying him as a war criminal. I mean, that's absolutely clear. And if they don't do that, then they are also complicit in war crimes.
Absolutely true. And I would like to return to the issue of the international monitoring agencies. But before we get there, just for clarification and for more information, it's very difficult to access information about what's happening. As you said, now there's been reports maybe of up in the hundreds of chemical attacks happening. First, I wanted to ask, from what you've seen, what chemicals are being used? Is it primarily white phosphorus, or only white phosphorus, or different chemicals being used?
No, actually, that's the more difficult side to ascertain what chemical weapons are being used. And I wouldn't like to say, because I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert in chemical weapons or anything like that, which is why the experts need to go there, because they're the ones that will determine whether chemicals have been used, what chemicals have been used. But what I will say is that the canisters that we've seen seem to indicate that it's ammonium nitrate. That's what I understand is being used by Turkey. And we've seen the photographs and the video evidence that with these canisters marked with ammonium nitrate, so we can guess that that's what it is that's being used. But it could be a mixture of chemicals. It's always very difficult to know, because I remember when I was in Halabja, I spoke to people there, and even 30 odd years later, they still weren't exactly sure what chemicals were being used. They just knew that chemicals had been used because people were collapsing and dying. And we can see from the how people are presenting in the hospitals. I mentioned the Kurdish villagers that were treated. They were treated for the presented with symptoms of a chemical that were consistent with a chemical weapons attack. Now, whatever it is, whatever chemicals they're using, it's certainly outside of the what is allowed in the rules of engagement, the rules of war, even though it's not officially a war. But it's it would certainly be a crime. But this is exactly, and it's a really important question. And it is a question that I've asked actually a number of times. But of course, the difficulty we have is that in the Kurdistan region itself, the government there, they don't want to investigate. But even if they did want to investigate, they probably don't have the technical capacity to do so, or the infrastructure to do so. The Iraqi government, I'm not sure if they have the technical capacity to do so. But they do need to step up as well, the KRG and the Iraqi federal government, to ensure that Turkey is held accountable. But also they need to be pressing the case more strongly for the United Nations and the OPCW and for NATO to intervene. Investigations have to be taken place, and it's all very well and good them denying that they're using them, but we need something a bit more concrete. And we need some serious action from the OPCW on this. Mm-hmm. By the way, I should say as well that I've contacted all of these organisations repeatedly during my coverage, and I've reported what I've seen on the ground, and I've asked them for comments, and I've asked them if they're going to take any action, but I've been met with an absolute wall of silence. And this to me is quite telling, because organizations, as a journalist, organizations normally respond, even if it's with a standard answer or just to say no comment, but they've ignored every request that I've made. And this leads me to believe that they're colluding in this, and I don't believe that they are neutral. I think that there's a deliberate cover-up of Turkey's war crimes, and there's a deliberate cover-up of the chemical attacks that are taking place. That's my view.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know, we've talked about the OPCW and these kind of things, but do you know if there's any monitoring agencies or human rights organizations internationally that have attempted to take it up at all or to ask questions thus far?
Very few. I think there was the International Panel of Physicians, a group of scientists recently that said that this must be investigated. I'm sorry, I can't remember their exact title at the moment, but I think that they made a call earlier this week. But which is very good. The Christian Peacemakers team, which are doing some fantastic work on the ground. I mean, they're I've absolute maximum respect for the work that they're doing, because without them, there would be there wouldn't be any kind of reports coming out at all, virtually. But they're doing some great work. They have also called for some kind of investigation to be conducted. They're recording and documenting the atrocities that are being carried out in the region. I don't know. I mean, there's some smaller human rights organisations that will be speaking out, but they're being ignored, and that's the point. The point is that nobody that should be speaking out is speaking out. So we should be expecting Masoud Barzani to speak out loudly about this. I mean, that's his job. The KRG should be issuing strong statements and calling for the world bodies to carry out investigations. Mustafa al-Khadimi, the Prime Minister of Iraq, and Barham Saleh, who's a Kurd, he's Kurdish, as the President of Iraq. Again, they should be the ones that are speaking out very, very strongly about Turkey's actions. There are some MPs that that are speaking out, and I believe that there's some members of the Iraqi Federal Parliament's one of their security committees has spoken out, but not as a committee, but as an individual member of that committee. So these are they're lone voices, against fighting against this wall of silence from the international community. Now, we do need people to be speaking out about this, not just inside Kurdistan, not just inside Iraq, but people need to be speaking out about this. And I'm expecting and I'm hoping that British politicians will be holding Turkey to account, stopping. There's very simple things that they can do to stop this from happening. If they wanted to, they could end it like that. With a click of a finger, they could bring an end to Turkey's war on Kurds, but they choose not to, and they continue with the diplomatic support, the military support, the economic support, and really Turkey needs to be isolated as a pariah state. This is what needs to be happening, not treated as a normal state. It needs to be isolated as a pariah state, not just for the war crimes that it's committing in Iraqi Kurdistan, but for the war crimes it's committing against its own people, for the crushing of democracy inside Turkey, for the oppression of the Kurdish people inside Turkey, for the war crimes that it's committing in Rojava as well, where chemical weapons are being used, and Turkey is is working with jihadist organizations. This is another important point to make, actually, is that what's happening in Iraqi Kurdistan is being supported again. Turkey has moved jihadists from Libya, from Syria, into Iraqi Kurdistan. So this is part of an ethnic cleansing operation. And I've spoken to many people that were forced out of their homes in Kurdish villages, that were forced out of their homes, that said that their homes were being taken, and they were being given to jihadists. And and they know this. They said people were speaking in Arabic, and they know that these are the same people. We're talking maybe 2,000 people, 2,000 fighters that have come across into Iraqi Kurdistan. So this is a NATO member state, a United Nations member state, which is quite openly using jihadist groups. Now, that's being done with the complicit consent of the world powers. So when they talk about the fight against ISIS, the fight against Daesh, the fight against Al-Qaeda, it's a lie. They're not fighting them at all. They're supporting them, and sometimes quite openly too. I mean, this is an important point to make. So people need to raise their voices about this. Turkey is a terror state. that's the bottom line. Turkey is a terror state. Tayyip Erdogan is a terrorist, and he should be dragged in front of the Hague. And Turkey is the biggest facilitator, along with the United States, actually, of global jihadism.
Absolutely. And to carry on from the point we were discussing before about Turkey becoming more emboldened, the more there is silence, using these same forces all across the region, whether in Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh, outside of Kurdistan too, and openly using jihadist forces. It's really mind-boggling in a way how out in the open it is, and that no one seems to care.
Yeah.
But to stay on this issue with the chemical weapons, to your knowledge, have there been any efforts of the people on the ground to kind of gather samples or anything like this to send to Europe or elsewhere? I don't know.
It is very, very difficult because, again, this is something that I've been asking and I've discussed, but of course, it's very, very difficult because when you use chemical weapons, it makes the site that the chemical weapons hit very difficult to go back to, because if you see when chemical weapons inspectors attend the sites, sometimes even months afterwards, they're in full hazcan suits, and of course the Kurdish guerrilla fighters don't have that kind of equipment, and unless you're an expert, it's very difficult to know what you'll be looking for in terms of a sample. What are you going to I guess some soil samples, this kind of thing. But if nobody's prepared to examine it, what are they going to do with it? That's the issue, because I don't know. My understanding is that, one, it's very difficult to go back to the site where the chemical attacks took place, and also there's not the facilities to carry out the rigorous examination of the any samples that are collected from there. So it's a very big difficulty. It's very difficult, and we have to remember that this is a war zone. These areas are being bombed. Now, one of the things I wanted to touch on actually is that and I believe that there is a link with this, is I wrote a story today in the Morning Star. I spoke to somebody in Shirnak, that the Turkish army are kidnapping the bodies of dead guerrilla fighters, dead Kurdish resistance fighters, and they're taking them from the battlefield over across back into Turkish borders, the Kurdish region there. They're taking them across into Shirnak, keeping the bodies in morgues for a few days, and they're refusing to hand them over to the families, despite pleas. Now, what they usually used to do, the forensic medicine unit would take DNA samples and match them so that they knew that it was a family member that had been killed. Now what's happening is these bodies are being taken in armoured vehicles and dumped into a mass unmarked grave and covered in mud. The graveyards themselves are guarded so that nobody can enter them. And I believe that there is a link between the two, because my guess would be that these are the victims of chemical attacks, and that if the bodies were returned to their families, or the forensic medicine department was to carry out investigations, they would find that the cause of death was from a chemical attack. And again, this is absolutely shameful behavior, even Kurds have no dignity even in death. But I believe that this is part of a cover-up of the use of chemical weapons. I think it's quite important to underline that. Now, the evidence is mounting up, and I don't know what more we need to present them. The evidence has been dead bodies, videos of dead bodies that very clearly look like they've been killed in a chemical attack. We've had gas canisters, marked with ammonium nitrate that have been found at the site of such attacks. We've had people presenting in hospital with the symptoms of a chemical weapon attack. We've had numerous reports from Kurdish resistance fighters, but also from ordinary Kurdish villagers who have said that chemical weapons have been used in the area. I've been to the site of some of these, some of the attacks. Certainly in Mackmore, I went to the site of a chemical attack there, and I spoke to people that were affected by it. So, might say, well, this is anecdotal evidence, but this is more evidence than was presented for ahead of the airstrikes after the Duma attack in 2018. So there's a long list of attacks. We can there's so many of them, I can't go into the detail, but we do have the exact dates and times that these attacks and locations that these attacks took place. So we've got a list of them. So it's not like they're unknown. We know exactly where they are. We know exactly where the chemical weapons were used. All we're asking is that people now, that the world powers, step up and carry out their responsibilities to investigate. That's it. I mean, it's a very, very simple request to do your job. And by refusing to do so, and by refusing to investigate, all they're doing is paving the way for more and more chemical attacks. So their silence means that they're complicit in chemical attacks. So that's it. I mean, that's we want people to raise their voices and say, look, Turkey's using chemical weapons, and just a basic thing. Come and find out about it. Come and do your research. Come and take some samples. It's kind of any other country in the world, and this would have happened months ago, and they'd have been condemned months ago.
Yeah.
But Turkey seems to have a free rein to do as it pleases.
Part of this wall of silence that we've been speaking about is the media dimension as well. That there's a handful of or some Kurdish media outlets in the region that report on it, and outside of the region, you are one of the very, very few that has been reporting on this. Can you say a bit about this dimension as well? Why people are the silence on that level, in that dimension?
I mean, the world of journalism has changed quite dramatically, I think. And as far as I know, I'm the only Western journalist that has been to the region. I'm the only Western journalist that has been to the mountains while Turkey's invasion has been taking place, and actually going to the sites and speaking to people. And the newspaper I work for is a very important one in terms of it's that it reaches out to trade unionists and Labour Party members and other progressive forces in Britain. But in terms of its circulation, it's obviously much smaller than the other newspapers. But again, if you look at this, comes down to the issue of media ownership, and they're making political choices by choosing what they report on, what they don't report on, and how they report on it. Now, take The Guardian, for example. This is seen by many in Britain as a progressive newspaper, but I would beg to differ on that very strongly. You go back to 2017, for example. The Guardian published a comment is free piece by Recep Tayyip Erdogan to talk about how Turkey has been a bastion of human rights in the wake of the coup. We wrote a letter in response to that, signed by Turkish and Kurdish organisations, and they refused to publish it. Now, it'd be very naive to think that editorial positions of newspapers aren't dictated to by who pays them and who takes out advertising. And The Guardian, is paid thousands by Turkish companies and Turkish organisations to run adverts, Turkish Airlines or whatever. So, there is a correlation, with that, and also, the majority of the Western press now, there was a time when journalism was about echoing the voices, giving a voice to the voices, and now it's about amplifying the voices of the powerful. And this is what we see across the press, is now that they operate really as an arm of the either the British intelligence services, the Ministry of Defence, or the British government, and they carry out their journalism on behalf of state powers. That's my belief. And those that buck the trend, like Julian Assange, end up in prison, or with facing extradition to the United States. And what was his crime was exposing the war crimes of Britain, of the US, of the rich and the powerful. There's a number of WikiLeaks cables on Turkey as well, and the relationship between Turkey and the imperialist powers. So it's not surprising. This silence isn't surprising, and it's not. Some people say, "Oh, if only they knew." They do know. Trust me, they do know. The Guardian knows, the BBC knows, the Times knows, the Telegraph knows, but they deliberately choose to ignore it. And why? It's because they support the imperialist aims of the world powers in that region. So they. I think that's what's unfortunately driving this, and that's why we see the silence from other organisations as well. I have to say is. The human rights organisations like Amnesty, I haven't heard much from them. Human Rights Watch, I haven't heard much from them. But again, these organisations, particularly those two, are funded by, by National Endowment for Democracy, for example, and have very strong links to the United States and their intelligence services. So of course, there's a reason that they stay quiet as well. It's a big multi-billion-dollar business, and are they purveyors of do they stand up for human rights? No, I think that they follow the tune and they are directed by the interest of US imperialism, because you'll see that the human rights that they stand up for are the ones that tend to be in countries where the US wants regime change, and there's a pattern there, and that's why we see this silence over the Kurdish question from those groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that's worth adding here is, as we've been saying, rightly so, that the ultimate forces at work behind these activities are the forces of imperialism at a global level, and all of these different, whether media or monitoring agencies, are becoming, you can say, like ideological state apparatuses to facilitate these activities. But part of this also being a part of the flip side to it, with respect to the Kurdish population, being the war on terror. And we have seen in other cases, like for example with Palestine too, what happens when you have a population of people who are represented by an organization, and that organization is criminalized under the war on terror. You criminalize the entire population, paving the way for this genocide that we've been talking about, really. But there's many more voices on Palestine than there are for the Kurdish case at this point.
That's a very good point, actually, and a very important one, because as we've seen with resistance organisations across the world are always criminalised. They're always deemed to be terrorists, whether it's Hamas who are the elected, whether you like it or not, they're the elected government in Gaza. Whether it's Hezbollah, who are seen as the main resistance to Israeli invasion in Lebanon, or of course with the Kurds, it's the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, are deemed a terrorist organisation. But these are all resistance organisations, and I think we know about the Belgian court case, which found that that the PKK shouldn't be deemed to be a terrorist organisation. And you're right in that it criminalises the entire Kurdish community, and that's exactly for Tayyip Erdogan, every Kurd is a terrorist. Everybody's a terrorist according to him that opposes him, but particularly the Kurds. So this campaign to delist the PKK is incredibly important, and I think that it's up to it's not up to outside powers or Western imperialist powers to determine the nature of a resistance movement. And like you said, there are many voices for Palestine, quite rightly, of course. I mean, there should be, but those voices should also be standing up for the Kurdish people too, because the struggles are identical in many ways. Both are nation states. The Kurdish people, the Palestinians, are both national liberation struggles. Both have had their lands stolen by imperialist powers, and both are waging a struggle against very, very powerful forces who are seeking their genocide on a very basic, simple level. I think that that there's a very, very deep connection between the two movements. They realise this as well, of course. The PKK were part of the resistance movement certainly in Lebanon during the Israeli invasion in 1982. If I'm correct, the first PKK fighter was killed in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. So they realised the similarities between those two struggles. And we should be, the Kurdish resistance movement and the Kurdish struggle should be as normalized and mainstreamed as the Palestine solidarity movement. They should both be they're both causes that should be adopted by progressive movements in Britain. Now, there are many reasons, I guess, that people fall over themselves to find an excuse not to support the Kurds. I've never found a good one yet, but this needs to change. And what we need, and I think I said this before, and it's still the same, is we need two things, and the two things we don't have are an independent media that is reporting on the Kurdish struggle, and we don't have a mass movement that is mass movement on the streets, which is exactly what is needed to build that kind of extra parliamentary pressure and to build a mass movement that will bring about change, that will reach into the trade union movement, which will reach into progressive organisations, which can actually take strong and firm action. And they're the two things I think we need at the moment. Now, there are a number of campaigns in Britain, and they all do slightly different and equally important work. One is Peace in Kurdistan, which I'm a patron of. I'm very proud to be a patron of, and it does some incredible work in terms of raising the very issues that we're talking about, and it has done for years and years. And they work very hard at European level, at parliamentary level, and they produce some incredible reports, working with academics, working with lawyers. And then there's the Trade Union Freedom for Öcalan campaign, which again, I was very proud to be part of the launch of that in the Houses of Parliament. And this is based on the trade union movement. So it was founded by GMB and Unite, but now has a growing number of trade unions on board. And what it does is it does what it says on the tin. It's campaigning for the freedom of PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan, who's been in jail for more than 20 years, held in isolation for large periods of it on the Emirati island. And his freedom really is the key to unlocking and solving the Kurdish question. There's been a big debate about this. We won't have time to go into this now, but there's been a big debate about who are the interlocutors in the so-called Kurdish question in Turkey at the moment, triggered by the Republican People's Party, Kılıçdaroğlu's comments on that. But whether it's the HDP or whether it's Öcalan, but there has to be a willingness to resolve this. And whether they like it or not, I think Erdogan knows that the dialogue has to take place with Öcalan, whether he likes it or not, and I'm guessing not, but he will realise, and the intelligence services will realise, and all invested parties will realise that they can talk. In the parliament is of course the correct forum to do this. Öcalan has said this too, but he will be party to those discussions, just as Nelson Mandela was central to the talks that ended apartheid in South Africa. I mean, it wasn't just that, but there was a mass movement that brought it down, and a mass global movement actually, which is exactly what we need for the same to replicate for the Kurdish question too. But Öcalan is the Mandela of the Middle East, as they call him, and that analogy and that comparison is a serious one, because in order to build bridges, in order to for truth and reconciliation and peace, then Öcalan has to be part of that dialogue, and he has to be freed from prison as part of that process too. So they're the kind of campaigns and issues that people can get and should get involved in. But my big thing is that there should be a mass movement as well, that is a street-based organisation that reaches into communities and does that kind of grassroots organising and builds the same, in the same kind of way that the Palestine Solidarity Campaign has. Now, we don't have that. There's, the Defend Kurdistan initiative could be the roots of something like that, but this is part of a longer term strategy, I think. But I think these are all important. These are all important aspects of the of the Kurdish freedom struggle, and I think the important thing is building beyond the diaspora, building beyond the Kurdish community, and as a solidarity organisation. But people need to raise their voices because the situation can't carry on as it is.
Absolutely. And one other organization I wanted to mention before we move on from this topic is the Campaign Against Criminalizing Communities, or CAMPAC, who we're happy to have co-host these interview series along with Peace in Kurdistan. And it deals with exactly this issue we've been discussing about how the criminalization of self-determination movements leads to the criminalization of entire populations. And we see this pattern, as you mentioned, repeated in so many different cases, whether it be the Kurds and the Palestinians who both work with, are part of the CAMPAC network, as well as the Tamils, the Baluch people, the Basques, and so on. Even in Ireland, we saw the same thing. And it is a very central issue, absolutely. But to move on to our final question, if that is all right with you, is, as we've been discussing, as you said, the need for, there's these different campaigns, the need for a mass grassroots level campaign, mass movement, which I fully agree with. But at this point in time, on the issue of chemical weapons, what, in your view, do you think can be done at this point, specifically by people internationally, outside of the region, and in places like the UK? As you said, it's not really an issue of lack of awareness on behalf of these organizations and so on, but in the public it is, but not of those organizations. So what do you think would be the most valuable efforts, kind of encouraging these organizations to take up the issue, a legal case against the Turkish state, multiple things?
I mean, I think there's many strands to how we approach this. I mean, a legal approach, but these things take a very, very long time. And I always say that they need a political solution, because it's not a legal problem; it's a political problem. And the world legal system is designed by the imperialist powers to entrench and deepen their rule. So I mean, it's you can put a lot of energy and effort into legal challenges that essentially get nowhere. They're only useful, in my view. Legal cases are useful in terms of raising the propaganda levels and to actually highlight that the law is not working on behalf of the Kurdish people, that it's a failed system, it's a rigged system, and then it opens up those questions about the nature of imperialism. And I think they can have a use in that, as long as we don't have any hope in getting any success out of them. I mean, it does happen from time to time, but I think people can do many things, but raise it with your MPs and ask them to raise it in Parliament. Get them to ask parliamentary questions. Get them to to do that. Those kind of probes. Now, again, huge demonstrations are very, very important, because believe it or not, they work, and people take notice of it. And while we might ask MPs to do something, unless there's a mass movement or a huge protest or something like this, they can ignore it a bit more easily then. But so if we're doing, street or outside the Houses of Parliament, this it needs to move beyond. At the moment there are demonstrations, but they're like in London, for example, they hold them at Manor House, which is a tube station in North London. Which it's good that people are doing stuff, but you really need to hit the centre of power. And that in Britain, that is the Houses of Parliament. In Britain, that is that's Downing Street as well. So we need those. we need those kind of things to happen. We need people to get more involved in the organisations that I mentioned before. Get involved in Peace in Kurdistan. Get involved in the Freedom for Urdulan campaign. Reach out to your local Kurdish community, because you'll have one, by the way. Whether you know it or not, there will be a Kurdish community wherever you live. But reach out to them and make links, so that we're now, that we're bringing the Kurdish question into the mainstream. So I think, there's an appeal also to the Kurdish community to get more involved in organisations like Stop the War, and to get more involved in organisations like CND, to join your trade union. So this is the other thing that people can do, is get your trade union branch to adopt motions, opposing what's happening, to issue statements, to really start ratcheting things up. Because trade unions, people think that they're weak now, but they still represent the 6.5 million trade unionists in the country. They're the most powerful organised force that we have, and these are the people that can affect change, and they can mobilise in big numbers. But they also have links to the Labour Party that they can use. There's a whole number of things. So raise it in your trade union branches. I'm quite happy to come and speak at public meetings as well. I've done a few across the country, and I'm very, very happy to do that, whether it's by Zoom or I can, we can travel by train now. I think in the COVID regulations have relaxed, so I'm quite happy to do that. But put it on your agenda. Keep it on the agenda of every single meeting that you go to.
Quickly, if it is all right with you, we will include your contact details in the description.
Absolutely fine. Yeah. You can include my contact details so people can get in touch with me. I'm very, very happy to do that. But yeah, this is the thing: is to keep raising the issue of Turkey's war crimes, to keep it on the agenda of every single meeting that you're going to, whether it's a Labour Party meeting, a Green Party meeting, a Stop the War meeting, a CND meeting, your trade union branch, Unite Community, whoever it is that you're involved in. Make sure that this issue is on the agenda at every meeting. Don't worry about becoming a bore about it. I do it all the time as well. And you'll find that actually people are very supportive. They're very shocked when they hear what's happening, and they want to do stuff. So then we can translate those motions and those words. We can then start translating into actions, and we can start building a critical mass. We can start calling protests. We can pick it outside MP surgeries. When we had the KDP in Parliament recently, but there was no, there should have been a protest there to meet him. So when we know that these people are coming to town, we can hold protests. Right to the all-party parliamentary group on Kurdistan, the ones that represent Iraqi Kurdistan, ask them why the hell they're not raising this in Parliament. Why aren't they doing their job? Stop acting as like, the Iraqi Kurdistan is some colonial outpost. Stop using it to go on jollies and trips. Stop using it to make money while people are living in misery and they're being bombed and they're being killed. Now this, we need to hold them to account. If they're serious about what they do, they need to be raising these issues. So yeah, lobby them. That's one thing that we should do. Why don't we get like a mass email campaign or something? I mean, this is a low level kind of thing, but if we start flooding them and demanding answers from them, then they'll be forced to take action. It's absolutely criminal that they're sitting there with all this money and they're sitting there with access to MPs and they're not raising this. I mean, Turkey's carrying out war crimes, and the group that's supposed to represent the people of that country are failing them and ignoring this. So there's many, many creative things that people can do. Activists are full of these great ideas, and that's the beauty of this kind of thing. But we need to keep raising the issue, and we need to make sure really that Erdogan is held to account for his actions, and that he's dragged to The Hague as a war criminal. That's what we want.
Absolutely. There's nothing I can add to that other than to just echo everything you have said, and as you said, be creative, and there are many different approaches and many different aspects that can be taken up,
and we can unite them all. That's the thing. I think if we can get this Defend Kurdistan initiative, something like this, launched, and and people want to get involved, I think that's really what we need. Something like this, a central organisation that people can get involved in, that can call actions and that can disseminate information. So if you're interested in helping get that up and running, drop me a line, because I think this is one thing that we can do.
Perfect. I think that is a good note to close on. Steve, thank you very much for speaking with us, and thank you so much for the incredibly valuable work you are doing, being in the region, reporting on issues that no one else is covering. Really, thank you. Are there any final thoughts you would like to leave us with in closing?
No, I think we've covered quite a lot, but I think just to say that we must stop Turkey's war on Kurds. We must stop the genocide, and we must stand in solidarity with the Kurdish people. That's it.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much. All right. Take care.
Thank you.